Welcome to the EDHEC webinar, What Really Works for Infrastructure Resilience and Decarbonization, inside ClimaTech's Global Framework of Climate Solutions. I'm Kimberly Gladman, a climate specialist at the Principles for Responsible Investment, the world's largest network of asset owners and asset managers focused on the investment relevance of social and environmental issues, including climate change. I'm delighted that for this live session, we have over 450 professionals registered from over 50 countries around the world. The session will be recorded and made available to access afterwards. Our session will be comprised of a 45-minute presentation by two leaders of the EDHEC Climate Institute, followed by a question and answer session. The Q&A function at the bottom of your screen can be used at any time throughout the presentation to submit questions. If we don't get to answer all of them on this session, we will circulate written answers to the remaining questions to all registered participants along with the slides for today's presentation. Now let me introduce our speakers. In the interest of time, I'll provide just a brief overview of their many accomplishments. Our first speaker is Dr. Nishta Manocha, who serves as project lead for ClimaTech at EDHEC's Climate Institute. Nishta has a strong background in engineering and public policy as well as business and investment, and she has brought this valuable cross-disciplinary approach to many academic publications and speaking engagements. She is joined by Conor Hubert, Sustainability Research Engineer at EDHEC, who has worked extensively on city and district level climate strategies and who now conducts research and analysis into physical and financial risks in the infrastructure sector. Both of them bring a combination of technical expertise and big picture thinking that are extremely valuable for our topic, and I'm grateful that they can be with us today. So now, Nishta and Conor, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kimberly, for those kind words, and thank you for being with us here today. Welcome, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who has joined us today. We are very glad that you can take some part of your valuable time and listen to what we have to present. Today is the official, this is the launch webinar of the ClimaTech project. So today we want to show you what we have been doing for the past few years in the space of ClimaTech, what the project actually is. We will introduce to you both the rationale for building this project, present the project to you, show you some use cases, as well as show you what are the new and exciting things that are coming in the time to follow. I would like to start with a brief introduction to the EDHEC Climate Institute. The EDHEC Climate Institute is a task force of experts dedicated to advancing applied research on both climate and finance. The Institute brings together researchers across France, the UK, Singapore, across multiple disciplines. About 60% of our researchers hold a PhD, and together we combine deep expertise in climate risk and quantitative analysis to strengthen how we measure the financial impacts of climate change. And we do this so we can have an impact in helping investors manage their long-term risks and also have our say in driving climate action and policy. Today, as I just mentioned, I'm very pleased to launch one of our key initiatives, the ClimaTech project, which is the world's largest repository and knowledge base of adaptation and resilience strategies for the infrastructure asset class. Now, before I actually present the project to you, I want to take a step back and talk about why we do what we do, what underlies the creation of this project, and take you on a little journey of all the research and information we've curated to enable the design of this project. I would like to give you three key insights on why we built the ClimaTech project. And the three perspectives that I would like to take you through to make the case for ClimaTech are: one, why is climate risk material? Why does transition risk and physical risk matter? I will give you some insights from the research that we have gained. Second, I want to give you an infrastructure investor and asset manager overview. So what do people in the space think about climate risk and how they are managing that? And finally, I will present to you evidence that we see when we track about 6,000 infrastructure assets globally on the space of what is the real world implication of transition risks and financial risks and what can we do about it. So let's start with materiality. it is now very clear that both physical risks and transition risks represent significant financial threats to infrastructure worldwide. According to our research, as presented in two papers, It's Getting Physical and Highway to Hell, it is very clear that transition risks alone could cause potential losses of about $600 billion across the infrastructure asset class from now to 2050. And at the same time, if we look at physical risks, events like floods, cyclones, storms, heat waves, sea level rise, droughts, etc., we find that some infrastructure portfolios could lose as much as 54% of their value in extreme scenarios. Now, these are not distant or hypothetical figures. They are very real, and they show us a very growing risk to investors' balance sheets. So now that we know that these risks are material, the next question is, what do investors and asset managers actually think and do about this? To find this out, we surveyed more than 200 infrastructure investors and asset managers globally, and the results are quite striking. First, 97% of them believed that physical and transition risk is real and significant, and about 2/3 of them expected it to have a meaningful impact in their investments. Most of them also highlighted the urgent need for better data, not only for risk management, which was, of course, the top requirement of requiring non-financial data globally, but also for stakeholder communication, regulatory reporting, and even for identifying new investment opportunities. In short, both research and the market tell the same story. Climate risks are material, and investors need better data-driven tools to manage them. The third insight I want to bring to you is from real-world evidence powered by Scientific Climate Ratings. Scientific Climate Ratings is an EDHEC venture that tracks over 6,000 plus infrastructure assets around the world. We look at about 101 infrastructure asset classes in multiple countries, and we quantify both their transition risks and physical risks, not looking only at the potential damage that these assets will face or the potential exposure that these assets have, but also more granularly at, for example, the emission characteristics of each asset class and the subsequent exposure to transition policies, or the damage that these assets face from independent risks like flood, storms, wildfires, etc. We then assess the financial implications of these risks, projecting how asset values could change under 8 different climate scenarios up to 2030 and 2050. In doing all of this, this allows us to pinpoint where the climate risks are most concentrated, which sectors are most at risk, how severe the damages could be, and more importantly, what it means financially for investors. Let's look at some results of this project. So we have, through Scientific Climate Ratings, we have a global picture of climate exposure. What I present to you here are the results of the climate exposure ratings presented by Scientific Climate Ratings. Now, if you look at the figure on the left, we have low exposure assets, which are assets that are rated A and B. And on the right, there are high exposure assets that are rated E, F, and G on a rating scale of A to G. And the difference between these two groups is quite striking. Among the low exposure group, 95% of assets that are rated A or B on a rating scale of A to G are renewable power assets. Logically, this follows, the pattern makes sense. These assets are, for example, solar assets, onshore assets, wind assets, etc. Now, in contrast, if you look at assets that are in the high exposure group, about half of them are transport assets, followed by conventional power, social infrastructure, environmental services, fossil fuel power generations, etc. So a lot of assets in a lot of different asset classes could be highly exposed to climate risk. But let's come back to the low exposure assets. We can clearly see that renewable energy assets overall are much less exposed to climate risk. Meanwhile, other asset classes are more exposed. But when we look a little bit deeper into what this distribution then breaks down to, so now I want to take your attention to the 3 graphs below, where I have a distribution of within each sector, renewable power, conventional power, and transport as an example, how many of those assets are rated A, how many are B, how many are C, and how many are D. And I've distributed this by physical risk and transition risk. Let's start with IC70, which represents renewable power. Here, about 35% of the assets have a low transition risk exposure, And about 20% of these assets are rated A for transition risk. But if you look at physical risks, only 6% of all renewable power assets have an A rating for physical risks. So what this means is that while renewables perform very well on transition exposure, they still face very meaningful and significant physical risk. For example, from windstorms, variability, etc. Now, if you move to IC10, which represents conventional power, we see much higher transition exposure driven by carbon intensity and regulatory change, for example. Now, these are also quite exposed to physical risk, with the majority of assets having an E and an F rating for physical risks, and a significant number of assets clustered in the high-risk categories. And IC60 transport is the same. There is a high exposure to transition risk as well as physical risk, and it's quite distributed as well. And these assets include assets like ports, airports, roads, etc. Hence the distribution. So in short, power and transport assets have a high exposure to both transition risk and physical risk, and renewable assets have a overall low exposure to climate risk, but between that, a much lower exposure to physical risk and a higher exposure to physical risk and a lower exposure to transition risk comparatively. Now let's go one more step further. Let's look at what these exposures actually mean in terms of financial damages or expected damages. Or in other words, how much are these physical risks going to have an impact on portfolios? Now, the chart on top combines the physical exposure ratings of assets with the expected damages from physical hazards projected out to 2035. What we can clearly see here is that the worst 18% of the assets, which are those rated in the F and G categories in the lower bar, corresponds to about 50% of total expected damages corresponds to about 50% of total expected financial damages. This highlights just how disproportionate the impact of physical risk can be on companies' balance sheets. It also shows that even sectors with lower overall exposure, such as IC70 or renewable power, can still face significant financial implications when damages are quantified in monetary terms. Now, results like this tell us that not all infrastructure is equally at risk. This type and scale of exposure varies depending on the sector, depending on the location, and is a mix of physical and transition pressures. This is exactly why detailed asset level analysis, like what ClimaTech and Scientific Climate Ratings provides, is so essential. It helps investors differentiate between risks, understand what to prioritize in terms of which risks to adapt to, and then know which strategies to apply to make smarter allocation decisions against both physical and climate risk and maintain alignment to their climate goals and long-term financial performance. Let's get a little bit more specific. Now, so far, we've seen that climate risk is material and that it has very real financial implications. Now, the question that we have today and the rationale for why we've built ClimaTech is what can asset owners and asset managers actually do now that we know these risks are important? What can they actually do to decarbonize, adapt, and build resilience? Now, the first step, as I just proposed, is recognizing that there is a need to objectively and systematically understand what to do. And once you know what to do, you need to know how to do it. So you need to know which strategies work, how effective are they, how much will they cost. Back to our survey. In the survey, we also found out that only 16% of investors or asset managers believed that the current state of knowledge on climate resilience allows for a genuine measurement of impact of infrastructure investments and a genuine way to react to it, which clearly shows that uncertainty still exists. So, as of today, investors not only need to know that they have to act, they know that, but they need to know what to do and how to do it. For example, if you want to protect a solar farm from storm damages, you can add a vegetated or structured windbreaks to reduce wind exposure. If you're managing data centers, you can install mechanical and natural cooling systems, which can help counter heat stress and maintain operational efficiency during extreme temperatures. For assets exposed to flooding, measures like elevated facilities, adding blue-green infrastructure, building seawalls, flood barriers can make a meaningful difference. And on the decarbonization side, investors can act across emission scopes. For scope 1 and 2, strategies like improving energy efficiency, switching to low carbon fuels, or using renewable energy are key for Scope 3 measures such as virtualization for data centers, recycling, sustainable procurement, can all contribute to lower life cycle emissions. But these are generic strategies applicable for a few asset classes. What is critical to understand is that this project is not just about a few case studies. There are, as we track, over 100 types of infrastructure assets worldwide, with their own vulnerabilities and their own possible interventions. Infrastructure owners, managers, and investors need to know what to do in a way that's systematic, objective, and consistent. They need to know what strategies work, how they can compare the outcomes of the strategy in terms of how effective they are, and how much they will cost across all asset classes. And this is exactly where ClimaTech comes in. ClimaTech provides the data, the science, and the structure needed to evaluate decarbonization and resilience strategies for every type of infrastructure asset in a clear, comparable, and actionable way. I will hand this over to Conor now to take you through what ClimaTech actually is and to show you some of our outputs. Conor, over to you.
Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me. So yes, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the ClimaTech project, a bit of an introduction, and what it contains and what you can use it for. So ClimaTech project at its heart is a repository of strategies for infrastructure assets that they can use to decarbonize or to build resilience to the physical effects of climate change. It is based on the EDHEC taxonomy of infrastructure asset types, which some of you may have heard of. It covers the vast majority of infrastructure asset types within 8 broad superclasses, which represent different infrastructure sectors. So these are non-renewable power, environmental services, social infrastructure, energy and water resources, data infrastructure, transport, renewable power, and network utilities. So between those, we've kind of covered most things. These are broken down further into 35 classes and 101 subclasses to provide sufficient detail for everybody to kind of understand their own particular assets that they're involved with. For each of these subclasses, we have found all of the most material strategies that asset owners can employ, and we cover both decarbonisation, including all 3 emission scopes, and 4 of the most common climate-related physical risks, including floods, storms, extreme heat, and wildfires. In total, we have about 103 strategies in over 1,800 combinations throughout the database, and all of this has been based on a thorough review of scientific and engineering technical literature. So just to dive in a little bit more into the detail of the kinds of things that we have in there, and also sort of the strategy analysis that we can do. Here is an example on screen of some of the analysis that we have done on the strategies within the database. This particular example is on asset decarbonisation and is a macro view across all infrastructure asset types. Here we're tracking how many times that strategy appears in the database against how effective that strategy is. So by looking across the whole infrastructure sector, we can really start to kind of cut through the noise of a lot of the sustainability reporting and discourse that's out there at the moment. Most people, know things like the headlines like renewables are good or insulation is good. But the real question that we have now is how good, and how good also compared to other options. And this is where ClimaTech comes in and where we really shine. We allow you to compare directly across different asset classes and to compare different strategies for the same asset classes in a systematic and objective way. So when we look at this in a bit more detail, up in the top right corner, we start to tease out some real nuances of the data that we've got. So here we have, in this bit up here, we have the kind of very effective strategies that are useful for lots of different asset types. And by picking these out, we can see what highly impactful decarbonisation levers the infrastructure sector can actually use. This is where we have things like sort of transport electrification, renewable energy generation. For a lot of certain asset types, it's about optimizing operational practices. A lot of these are sort of high impact and high frequency strategies are also in and of themselves enabling infrastructure that can be invested in separately. and that improves the kind of value proposition, generally speaking, for investors. It's just a quick note here. These are the maximum values. Often when we look at differences between asset classes, the same strategy might have a broad range of effectivenesses, but we wanted to just to demonstrate the maximum here to kind of really pull out some insights. The differences between different subclasses in terms of ranges is all captured within our database. It's just this particular slide doesn't demonstrate it. Below those on the bottom right, we have, again, sort of very powerful strategies, but they're quite niche. They are only applicable to one or two asset types, but they really kind of pack a punch beyond what their narrow applicability might suggest. So, for example, things like low carbon heating or leakage reduction in gas pipelines. For some assets, they actually kind of represent the best hope for decarbonising those asset classes, as they have a sort of outsized impact on emissions reductions, compared specifically to the number of strategies they actually need to be invested in. So, for example, biogas capture and utilisation is absolutely critical for certain waste and wastewater asset types, but is, to be honest, largely irrelevant to most other asset classes within the infrastructure spectrum. We have in the middle a bunch of strategies that are kind of widely used, but a bit middling in their effectiveness, but they're broadly applicable. So these are things that are good to do, but probably shouldn't be the first option that asset owners would be looking at if there are other options available that are more effective. However, on the flip side, some of these strategies also reduce energy usage quite often, and that has the benefit of potentially reducing OPEX. So it might be a bit more of an attractive option from a cost benefit point of view. One of the highly impactful things that we were looking at here is also the fact that it allows us to kind of cut through a lot of the symbolically used actions, but actually those that have sort of a low impact. And we, as we were looking through these, sort of excluded these, as we didn't consider them particularly material to what we were trying to do. This is the sort of thing of, I think changing light bulbs in an airport or converting your maintenance fleet to electric vehicles if you run a coal plant. It's kind of nice to have, but doesn't really significantly move the needle when it comes to emissions reductions. Below these in the bottom left, we actually have some sort of low impact, low frequency strategies. Again, quite niche, but for certain asset classes, in particular things like social infrastructure assets, there are not very many high impact strategies, but quite a lot of sort of low to medium effectiveness ones that in total sum to a big impact, even if their own impacts seem a little underwhelming at first. So these are some of the kinds of insights that we are able to do with the climate data that we have. The ClimaTech project is both this kind of macro view, looking at the infrastructure asset class in its totality, but also drilling down really into individual asset types, what you can do, how individual asset types within the same infrastructure sector, so for example transport, how they differ, how the effectivenesses of the same strategies are different between those, and what really can be done. So really kind of just cut through a lot of the general noise that you hear in a lot of this space. So in terms of what you guys can use, we've used this massive data and written a set of research papers that you can now go onto our website and download and read, should you choose to. The link to these is down at the bottom. We have a very detailed research paper per superclass. So if you're only interested, for example, in transport infrastructure, go in there. Only interested in data infrastructure, just look at that one. If you're more interested in it from an overview type of perspective, then we have an overview paper which looks at all 8 infrastructure classes in their totality and assesses it that way. It's worth noting just that the more detailed papers have additional layers of analysis than what we've presented here today. So, for example, for decarbonisation, the effectiveness of each strategy is then multiplied by an average emissions profile for different asset classes. So you can really start to drill down into, okay, well, this is a highly effective strategy, but it only covers a tiny proportion of my emissions. Is that better or worse than a less effective strategy that covers a broader range of emissions? So you can start to really look at those sorts of things as well in the different papers that we have. In addition, we also just have information on things like average event severity that certain resilience strategies are typically designed to protect against. And these are sorts of things that are in these papers and are, as I said, freely available on our website. Linked to this, we have the actual database, which is also available. And so you can go in there. This is just a screen grab example, but you can filter by specific asset type, the type of risk you're looking at. It allows you to very quickly compare strategy changes in effectiveness between asset classes, for example. You're looking for what the most effective or the least effective strategies are for a particular asset type. And again, this is all available freely online and as part of this launch. So just want to very briefly talk through some of the key applications of ClimaTech, now that you've got a bit of a flavour of the kind of things that we have that you can look at. The ClimaTech project is intended to be useful to a very wide range of different actors within the infrastructure space. So, for example, you could be a regulator trying to assess the validity of company sustainability reports, or an infrastructure investor looking to how to prioritise some of your investments from a sustainability point of view. Or maybe you're an analyst and you're conducting, asset, portfolio, or sector sort of risk analyses. So all of this is definitely things that this can be used for. In terms of real-world applications of this so far, it's the ClimaTech database is one of the backbones of the adjustment process used by the scientific climate ratings, as that Nishta mentioned earlier, to change the asset scores based on what they've actually done to protect themselves. The example here down at the bottom of the slide is a real rating of an airport asset, where the baseline case gave it a physical rating of F, which is not particularly good. But then, based on their sustainability reports and what we could find in there, they've actually done a couple of flood resilience measures, so we can adjust that. And then using the ClimaTech database and the effectivenesses of the strategies listed, the actual overall asset rating went from an F to a C. So this is basically purely on the effectiveness information that we have within the ClimaTech database. So there are real-world applications, and they are kind of cross-relevant to lots of different actors within the space. Just a quick note here, all of this is being reviewed by a committee of experts drawn from multiple different fields, academia, finance, engineering, some multilateral organizations. And all of it is it's being reviewed, and we are going through the process over the course of the next year, where we will be getting feedback from them and incorporating their commentary and updates into the reports and providing updated papers beyond that. This is to ensure the robustness of the information that we're providing, and also ensure that we are up to date with sort of the latest best practice within the industry. So it's worth noting, if any of you here today are interested in joining the review committee for any of the 8 superclass papers, you are more than welcome. We have an open invitation to anybody who is interested. So if you would like to, please feel free to reach out to my colleague Rob Arnold, whose email is at the bottom of the slide, and we will see what we can do. And there's just for information a list of some of the members that we have and some of the organisations that we have on board already. Just to wrap up from my end, I've given you an overview of the research that we currently have. But I would just quickly like to talk about what we're doing over the next sort of year. So the first thing that I personally will be doing is looking at the EU taxonomy and seeing how all of the infrastructure asset types and strategies that we've pulled together, how they map over to the taxonomy and what taxonomy activities are relevant and applicable, and how that affects asset and activity eligibility. But beyond that, we will then be trying to integrate cost data into the database so that you might be able to start using it to understand the real cost effectiveness of certain strategies, and then use that to be able to make investment decisions and such like. And then finally, we are going to expand into new sectors beyond infrastructure. It's obviously very infrastructure focused at the moment, but we will be probably looking at the corporate sector next, and then potentially moving on to things like real estate and manufacturing, but that's to be decided. But yes, and that is it from me. Thank you very much.
Okay. Conor, this is wonderful. Thank you, Nishta and Conor, very much. One of the questions was about a particular use case. Could you give an example? Do you have anything that you can share with us just to take us a little bit more into the weeds, like one example of an asset that you analyzed?
Of course we can. We have slides in the annex. You want to go for that?
Yeah, yes, okay, yes. So we have some additional slides that we're hiding at the back, hidden slides at the back of the presentation. So here's one I prepared earlier. We have, so we've looked at particular transport assets. I think we were asked to do some work on data centers in particular. So this is a sample of, it's not everything, but it is a sample of, for example, some of the decarbonisation strategies on top and the flood resilience strategies below. This is very particular to data centers. The other class of infrastructure within the data infrastructure grouping is data transmission assets. They have different strategies, different effectivenesses, and that sort of thing. We've also done some particular work on ports. We've done work on airports. We've done individual bits on some renewable energy assets and that sort of thing. And yeah, so we have a number of these. We've done a load of work, particularly with some Australian airports that I was talking about earlier as well. So individual assets and individual subclasses too.
I would like to add here on this slide particularly, I think this is a great showcase of the actual information and the tables that we will find if you go into the independent reports that we have. So we have 8 reports for each infrastructure superclass, as well as if you go onto the website to interact with this data. So here what you have is an example of data center, as Conor mentioned, but you can see here that the database, the knowledge base that we have put together outlines strategies that are applicable, tailored to that infrastructure asset class. Of course, it describes them as a description because different things can mean different things in different use cases. It tells you, for example, let's look at the table on top first and then go below. So in the case of decarbonization, if a data center was to do this, how would you, if your question would be, how do I reduce my scope 2 emissions particularly? We would say focus on renewable energy, yes, but you have to go a little bit further. What kind of technologies can you use? So that is the information you would get in column 4, for example. And for each of this, we would also tell you how effective this would be. Here is a little element or nuance I would like to add. So when you use renewable energy and I say 100% effective, it means 100% effective in decarbonizing the energy usage it replaces. So of course, there's a distinction here between how effective a strategy is as well as the decarbonization potential. So in the papers, you also find that for each type of asset class, we have a classic exposure, a classic emission profile. So which takes the emissions associated with each category of, or each characteristic emission, multiplies that with the effectiveness, and that gives you the decarbonization potential as applicable to each asset class differently. And these numbers can vary quite a bit across the different infrastructure classes. So we do that for scope 1 and 2, as well as for scope 1, 2, 3. So this gives you a sort of a comparative parameter on how you would use these strategies across different asset classes. And when it comes to physical risk, we have similar data for all of these infrastructure asset classes across the risks of flood, storms, heat, and wildfires. So again, if you want to know how you protect your asset from flood, you can elevate it. Okay, it gives you a description. So you can't elevate the whole thing. In some cases, you can only elevate specific components, or you can protect only specific critical components, etc. And those are discussions and commentary that you will find in the papers. You will also find the key technologies used. And here, in the case of physical risk reduction, if you want to understand how effective a strategy is, yes, again, you elevate your asset, you're protected from the water from the ground. But you have to also know that to what hazard intensity does this protect you. So here is what we add, that for each kind of physical risk, what is the typical design level something is built for? So that gives you, again, a very quick screening to try to understand the impact or the risk reduction that your asset will get as a result of the strategy. So the The objective of putting this data together is to make something, or is to collate information into something very simple, but yet very powerful, in which you can do it very quickly and again, comparably understand how your risks will reduce as a result of applying an independent strategy.
Okay, maybe I'll just draw. I'm just looking at people's questions in the chat. I have been a reviewer for so far one of the reviews, so I can answer some of these questions that in the papers, if you read them, there is a lot of detail about the vulnerability of different types of technology and what's most effective, and about physical risk. So if you look at some of those papers, some of these questions, you'll see those answered. But I don't know from having read that first one, this question someone's raising about how the different climate scenarios, can you talk more about how the different climate scenarios that you looked at and the different possible transition paths, how that informed this work?
Sure, I can take that one. I would like to make a distinction here that today we've used the work of scientific climate ratings to make a use case for ClimaTech, and all of the work on the risk assessment and scenarios and analysis was simply to point out the fact that infrastructure assets are heavily exposed to all of these things and we have to do something about it. But here I'm now venturing into the scientific climate ratings category. I am very happy to do that. So for scenarios, we use the classic scenarios that we have available from literature, from IPCC, from NGFS, from EDHEC, etc. And there is another research stream within the EDHEC Climate Institute, which focuses on scenario probabilization. So we take all of these scenarios, we take where the world is at today, and we project or we put probabilities on how likely is each of the scenario expected to be in terms of materialization. And we take all of those probabilities accumulated together to build these ratings for this expected scenario. There are multiple, there are a few research papers that we've written about this. I will be very happy to add links to that, to this deck when we send it across. And as well as I would take this opportunity to invite you to another webinar that we're doing tomorrow for scientific climate ratings, in which we will answer all of these methodological questions on how we assess flood risk, how we deal with scenarios, how we use geolocation to draw detailed asset boundaries and do physical risk assessments on that.
Of just answering some of the other questions. So they are amazing, I must say. These reports are amazing. They do talk about different strategies, how much emissions are associated with them, and some of the questions people are raising in the chat, like, well, do you look at the supply chain and all the dependencies and effects? Like, yes, it's a work of incredible complexity in that sense. And it was very educational for me as somebody who works with asset owners and investment managers who were not necessarily infrastructure specialists, right? I work with many investors who are engaging companies that they hold, whether they're public or private, and wanting them to implement carbon emissions reduction strategies or net zero programs and transition plans. And there's a real need for that investor group to be more educated, right, about what are the options, and to not just listen to the corporate person will tell you, well, this is what we're doing and this is great. And I learned so much just from reading one of these reports about, well, yes, these things do sound great, but there's 3 different ways you can implement that, and the devil's in the details, because for this one, the supply chain issues and various things mean it doesn't really have such a carbon emissions reduction impact as it sounds like when you first hear about it, right? So these are extremely useful, and I really encourage people to read them. Can you say something, Nishta? Somebody asked that, like, the technical details. How is this free? How do I access this? Practical. How do people get a hold of this information?
So we have to all the slide decks. Long story short, all the papers are free. They are available online. They are absolutely, we welcome you to read it. And as Conor mentioned before as well, for all the papers, we have an independent review committee, at least 3 reviewers from different sectors per paper that read these papers and comment on the scientific robustness of it. So if you would like to go one step further from just reading a report to commenting on it, we would love to hear from you. The database as well is completely free. It is available online on the EDHEC Climate Institute website. There is a link to the papers as well as the database in the slide deck. So when we send it forward, you will be able to access it. And I think there were a couple of questions I see on the ratings data as well. I'm crossing paths here again, but the climate exposure rating data set is also available at the Scientific Climate Ratings website. Again, on the slide deck underneath there's a link to that as well. So a lot of this data is available online. Of course, the Scientific Climate Rating data, which is a venture, it is governed by some terms of use, but the ClimaTech data is available to use freely as you like. We welcome you to do research. We welcome you to use this data to build use cases for us. And I would like this opportunity to also say that if you have projects that you feel that could undertake ClimaTech analysis, so if you have use cases where you know that you've implemented a bunch of these strategies and that has reduced your decarbonization or it has moved you forward in the net zero resilience plan, we as a research group would love to read that and to implement that into our papers as examples as well. So please send them our way if you have interesting things that you want ClimaTech to look at.
Conor, do you want to add, I just said enthusiastically, it's amazing how you talk about all the effectiveness strategies and the different unintended consequences. Do you want to add a little more, from an engineer perspective, say a little bit more about how you come up with strategy effectiveness, or perhaps also this question of scope 3 and the different, unintended consequences or supply chain things, that sort of thing. How did you calculate that?
Yes, my background is an engineer, so I come at it from a sort of very practical perspective. There was always a tension within this project between finding data that was detailed enough to provide robust evidence, but also broadly applicable enough that it wasn't just asset specific and that was all you could do with it. It was only applicable to one thing. So we have tried to find a balance between those two competing aims. And so all of the research that we've done is based on, for example, academic literature or technical reporting from engineering and scientific firms, some government literature, that sort of thing. So it's really kind of, we try to go in as much as possible with sort of peer-reviewed information and that side of it. And numbers, when we try to find numbers in particular, we were looking at trying to find them from multiple sources, etc., so that we could kind of realize that we were in the right ballpark with them. And then in particular, your question about scope 3, that information honestly was very, very scarce when we started looking. It improved over the course of the project as people kind of gained a bit more knowledge of it. But it required a lot of digging. So there are some limits on how far up supply chains we can go. But we actually managed to get quite a lot, and quite a lot of it was kind of, it's from robust peer-reviewed work. But it depends on which particular assets, which particular supply chains, and that side of things. So yes, hopefully that answers your question.
I would also just like to add here is that the database that's online actually gives you link to all the references that we've used, and there's not a single number in the database that has not been cross-referenced to something out there. So if you would like to go in and see where we got our numbers from, please do. And if you have better numbers, please tell us. We will use them.
Thank you. Yes, I can concur that as a reviewer, you're asked to look through everything quantitative and say, do you think our quantitative estimates are right? And if not, do you have better evidence? And so I really admire that what you're doing, you've done a tremendous literature review already, and you're kind of creating an ecosystem where new findings can be added to this, so that we're really pooling the intellectual capacity of everybody working on this, which is amazing. But so I wanted you to speak a little to that, Nishta, as somebody who's probably more familiar with this research, the two of you, than anybody else. You have really this overview now. Are there particular gaps in the literature? There always are, right? Because academics are working under all sorts of pressures of their own that are maybe not, they don't sit there and say, what does the world need? And let's research that, right? So what are the kind of gaps that inevitably have emerged? And, a lot of us talk to young people who are going into graduate programs, who are graduate students looking for dissertation topics, or faculty members looking for, what do I write my next book about? What would you say to academics who are like, I'm ready to work on this, I want to help? What would you say to them? How could they help contribute to develop this further?
Thank you, Kimberly. That's such a great question and very aligned with the academic nature of our work at the Institute as well. Now, to give you, I would say that while there is already a breadth of literature individually and about multiple infrastructure sector topics, in our research or through this process of collecting and collating information, the most challenging part for us was to distill a set of data that was comparable across sector, that could be easily understood and applied. And there was very little data about it. So at EDHEC, our objective to do research is to make an impact. And that's what we want to do. We wanted to create a project, a research knowledge base that is, of course, I've mentioned this a few times again, but I think this is so important, that we wanted to create a project that is academically robust, simply so it can be used across the chain of infrastructure investments. We wanted to create something that investors, asset owners, asset managers, researchers, young graduates, professors, people who want to write books and need a base to compare how things move against one another, to actually do that. And that's what we were trying to do. But in the same spirit, to new graduates, we would like to say that when you approach complicated, wicked problems like this, sometimes they're very simple. This is not a difficult problem we approached. It was just a very resource-intensive problem we approached. So when you move forward, when you're trying to design an approach to these solutions, please spend a little bit of time thinking about who will use this research. And that's what really helped us build ClimaTech, because we had in mind those 4 or 5 different use cases that we wanted this project to amount to. And I think that's one of the key advice that I would give young graduates is like, please keep the use case in mind. Don't try to create research and fit it to a use case, but do it the other way around, and then you can create very powerful tools out of that.
That is just excellent advice. So from the investors that I speak to, right, are a lot of institutional asset owners or, again, generalist asset managers, largely dealing with, the securities, often publicly traded, right, infrastructure companies. And they are trying to do this generalist engagement. So for them, a question is, well, okay, if I look about all these sectors and I'm not going to become an expert in each one, are there common themes or principles that emerge from all this research about what type of measures should be taken first when a decarbonization or resiliency project of any kind gets underway? Are there some high-level takeaways that apply across all these sectors?
Yeah, I'll jump in on that one if I may. Without meaning to completely start on a bit of a negative, the first kind of overarching trend that we found was just very much a lack of data and a lack of information available. And where we sit in this is there's often very high level information and then very, very detailed technical information. And the worlds of engineering and finance talking two separate languages, and never the twain shall meet. So that was one of the things, but also a lot of the technology that we were talking about already exists. A lot of this is stuff that is not particularly expensive. It's highly effective. It doesn't require, some of them do, yes, there are particular examples which require new technologies, advancing technologies, etc. But a lot of them are, stuff that for all intents and purposes you could go out and buy off a shelf. And so there are real world constraints and that kind of thing. I completely get it. But in terms of what is available, what you can do to make an impact, how you as an asset owner, whatever particular stakeholder you are, there are things available for you to do right now. It's just a case of getting the right advice, doing a bit of digging, and trying to cut through a little bit of the noise, as I was calling it before, to try and understand particularly what's relevant.
So, so you alluded earlier, Conor, to the fact that there's been some shift somewhat in the data availability, but could you talk a little more? Both of you have had a long experience before this project of different kinds of research in climate and technology, and then you've been involved in this for several years. So are there any trends you see in overall in data, in disclosure? What is there that investors should know about what's been happening recently?
Oh.
Mano? You can take it, no problem.
I can talk a little bit about the specifics of some of the data side of it, rather than more so than the kind of reporting side of it. But one thing, we started this project 2.5 years ago, and even in that time frame, very diverse groups of stakeholders are now starting to talk to each other to try and fill in the gaps. Everybody sort of seemed to realize at the same time that nobody really knew everything and had the whole picture. And so, hey, that was a great business proposition for us in terms of what we were trying to produce. This is the niche we try and fill. But also, it's about getting the right people together from different views. Engineers talk to other engineers. Finance people talk to other people in the finance world, and it's about kind of crossing those bridges, to use a terrible infrastructure pun. And from that point of view, the conversations are happening. The data is becoming a lot less siloed, and people are trying to work out how to share that between them so that everybody can kind of understand what best practice actually currently means.
I would now add to it, since both of us were trying to say having the same thing, but in a different way. I think we've mentioned this before, but I'm going to bring it back again. When we started to put ClimaTech together, our first, and we thought it would be very easy, because we thought we're going to look at 10 reports, one from each sector, sustainability reports, and we're going to see what people do, and we're going to put them in an Excel sheet, and we're done. And oh boy, how wrong we were. So we started with trying to review 100+ reports of the top infrastructure companies, and we found very little or almost no information. Of course, we found a lot of plans, we found a lot of things that people want to do, but very little quantified numbers on what this really means, how much will it do, and by when. So there was, and this was very disconcerting. We were like, hey, if these guys don't know what is happening here, and that was also one of the driver of our research. But this changed during the project. Now, when we look at sustainability reports, I feel that the quality of disclosure has improved. There is still some place to go, but now I feel I can look at some reports, I can gather some information, and I can use that to supplement the research origin of my number. But this was not the case some time ago. So what I would say that the use case or examples available below then, this has changed in the past, but I think this private infrastructure sector that we deal with needs to report a little bit more. And I'm coming back again here to my call for the audience. If you have projects that are exemplary and leading in this space, please let us know.
Great. We have time for a few more questions from the chat. Right, everyone's talking about AI right now, and I'm a little on the Luddite side. I personally always bristle a little about AI, but I think it's something everybody who works in big data heavy projects, we have to answer that question, or at least think about it, right? Is this a case where AI could be helpful? My gut instinct would be no, it's so complicated. My experience with AI projects is it's doing interesting things, but it's not yet able to handle such nuanced things and understand what it's looking at. But I could be wrong. So what do you think, Nishta and Conor? Is there a way that AI could be speed up the use? Or the larger question is, how can we get this information to be used faster? What do we need to do? Is there a technological situation? Is there an educational? What can we do to get this, actively used?
So I'm going to divide the answer into two. I'm going to divide the answer into how can AI help to create this information first, and then how can AI help to use this information? That's second, that's downstream, that's a bit complicated. But for the first one, I think it's, yes, it's complicated, but it's also incredibly powerful to use AI for, so for example, we can use natural language processing to go through, so if you're manually reading a document, it takes quite a while, but now we can take a bunch of sustainability reports, use our database to cross-reference very quickly with natural language processing to see what type of companies in what sector use what. So it very quickly tells you, are these strategies actually being used or not? That's one. Second, what we can also do is, so at this point of time, the creation of this database was manual. I thoroughly enjoyed the research project because I love shutting myself in a room and reading research papers. It's great. But at the same time, we could have done this faster as well. Rather, we should do this faster in the future, saying in fact that, again, we can use natural language processing to group a bunch of reports together and to extract strategies. Obviously, it will have to go through a layer of validation from us, but I think it would be a very nice first step in collecting this information together. And in terms of how AI can enable the use of this information, I think that depends on what you want to use it for, with all the different use cases that we are trying to build. So we have been very carefully and mindfully creating this information, different types of database and papers, so it's so it's easier for you to use. Now, whether you use it through a tool, through an API, or as a research paper that's on you, that's not something I would be able to recommend.
Great. There's also some specific questions about carbon capture that I'm going to leave aside here because those will be answered if you look at the research papers themselves. But there's another question about the EU taxonomy, and I would sort of broaden that to, like, I think globally now we're in a period where there's a real divergence. You have a lot more disclosure requirements in Europe, not so in North America. Other places are sort of in between. It really varies a lot. And so I guess the question I'd be interested in hearing your thoughts about is, how has that taxonomy and reporting requirements in general improved the quality of the information? Has it improved the quality of the disclosure and the insights that you can gain for it? Or, as some people hope, or the other critique is, oh, that just means you get a lot of boilerplate and people give you kind of standard disclosures that aren't that insightful. What's your sense of what effect those kinds of reporting requirements have had?
I'll build on what Nishta was saying about 5 minutes ago. There has been, I think initially, when a lot of these new reporting requirements came in, there was a lot of boilerplate. There was quite a lot of relatively generic things being said that didn't have a great deal of detail. They weren't particularly robust and backed up and that kind of thing. However, I would say that the requirements of these regulations has pushed conversations within organizations that potentially would not have happened before. And now the pushback against such boilerplate rhetoric is now meaning that the quality of corporate sustainability reports, etc., and the conversations that are being had are now better than they were. Now, they have a ways to go, as Nishta said, but it's definitely steps along the right journey.
Thank you very much. Yes, I think that's what we can hope for, right? Is that that push and pull and the, that we eventually make progress. It's not going to happen all the first time that a disclosure is made, but I do hope we're in a good phase of that improving. So our time is nearly at an end. I want to thank our speakers very much for coming and all of our attendees for being with us. A recording of this webinar and the slides will be sent to all registered attendees. And as Nishta and Conor have said, we would be very grateful to see the email on your screen if you have additional inquiries or want to become a reviewer and help us improve this project. We'd be very grateful to have you join us. So thank you very much for being with us and have a good day.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.